Welcome to All Autism Talk, connecting the autism community one podcast at a time. Our podcast offers friendly conversations with inspiring individuals in the autism community. All Autism Talk is brought to you by Learn Behavioral and the Learn Provider Network. Now here's your host.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of All Autism Talk. This week, I had an opportunity to sit down with Dr. Pamela Feliciano, the scientific director of SPARK, one of the world's largest autism research studies. In addition to being a researcher, she's also a mom of an autistic child. One of my key takeaways from this conversation was that she said, behind every piece of data is a person. And I think that's really reflective of the SPARK approach and how much they respect and support each of the individual families. I hope you learn a lot from this conversation with Dr. Pamela Feliciano. Hi, Pam. Thanks so much for being here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So I really want us to talk about, genetics and how all the research you're doing is leading us to more information about genetics. Can you tell us a little bit about what we currently know about genetics and autism?
Sure. So most people don't quite realize this, but autism is quite heritable and has a very strong component of genetics. And we've known this since the 1970s. So in the 1970s, there were twin studies that were published looking at the rates of autism in identical twins, comparing them to fraternal twins and comparing them to siblings. And if you look at these three groups, all of which have different shared amount of genetic material, in identical twins, the concordance rate in autism is very high. So it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 78 to 80%. That means if one identical twin has autism, 70 to 80% of the time, the other identical twin has it. And if you look at fraternal twins, that percentage is lower. It's about anywhere between 30 and 40%, depending on what study you're looking at. And that is lower than identical twins, but higher than full siblings, even though fraternal twins share the same amount of genetic material as full siblings. So the percentage in siblings is somewhere between 10 and 20%. And what all of that tells us is that there is a strong heritable genetic component to autism, but there's also an environmental effect. And there's been work done in this area, and we know less, I would say, about the environmental risk factors that play a role in autism, although there has been some progress in this area. So since then, scientists have been trying to discover the types of genes that are involved in autism. Autism is very complicated. It's very heterogeneous, not just in how it presents. So people with autism can be somewhere on a very wide spectrum. But the genetics of autism is very heterogeneous too. So we've identified probably almost 200 genes that are involved in autism. But we think that there are probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 to 1,000 genes involved in autism. And it makes it a complicated condition to study and try to understand at the cellular level what's happening in someone with autism, and what makes their cells different than someone without autism. But we definitely have made progress, and the 200 genes that have been discovered so far allow scientists a way in. It's an anchor. Right. So when you understand the genes that are involved, you can look at those genes in developing neurons in mouse models and animal models, in vitro and also in humans, and try to understand what's happening and where the genes are not working as they might be in someone without autism.
That's so fascinating. I have so many questions because how did we even get the first 200? Was it really just trial and error, go gene by gene and see?
No, but so the very first genes were probably discovered, I would say, in the 1990s. So things like Rett syndrome and Fragile X, there are different ways in. I mean, it was basically just studying a lot of humans and also looking at animal models. I think there is starting to be an appreciation for the type of genetic variants that are involved in autism. So many people with autism don't have any history of autism in their families. And there are many reasons for that, but one reason that we've realized in the past 15 years that's important are changes that occur in the sperm or the egg that makes that person. So this is not something that is inherited directly from a parent. So the parent doesn't have this change themselves. It's just in the single sperm or egg that made the child. So these types of mutations are known as de novo mutations, and probably 10 to 20% of autism can be explained by these types of genetic differences. So what happened with those types of differences, I guess this was probably in the late 90s, early 2000s, people hypothesized that these might play a role, so they looked for them. And they were able to identify genes and big sections of the human genome that were found in multiple people with autism. And then eventually they were able to find, maybe 30 or 40 different places in the human genome that are different in people with autism and were occurring in a de novo fashion. And since then, as technologies have gotten better for sequencing exomes, and that happened in the early 2000s, it's been possible to sequence a human's DNA material.
It's so incredible. I'm wondering, as we progress down the genetic research path, at some point, is this going to improve our diagnostic tools and things of that nature?
So what comes first, the diagnosis or the behavioral diagnosis? I mean, I think autism right now is still and will be for a long time a behavioral diagnosis. We're not at the point where we understand autism well enough that we have some kind of biochemical marker that would help with like really early diagnosis. I think that there is a future in which genetic sequencing can help with diagnosis, but I think it's mostly going to help guide research and help scientists understand the differences in the cells of people with autism compared to people that don't. And by looking at that and being able to understand that, we'll be able to get to some treatments for the core symptoms of autism. So if you think about a condition like diabetes or cancer, where if you ask someone on the street, what causes diabetes, like we all know that it's an insulin problem, and we know that the pancreas is involved and that people's kidneys don't function. Or in cancer, we know what the differences are. But in autism, we don't have that at the cellular level. We can't explain what's happening. And I think understanding the genes will get us there.
Yeah. And I imagine it would probably open up a whole host of other information also, right? It would probably inform, I don't know, medications, diets, or all that would have to at least continue to be a part of the conversation at that point, right?
Yeah. I for the most part, the genetic results that we return are not necessarily helpful at this moment for treatments. There aren't any treatments for autism at this time. Core of medical, like pharmaceutical treatments, not ABA, obviously.
Right.
I'm a huge ABA person. So there are no pharmacological treatments for the core symptoms of autism. But as we get to a deeper understanding of what autism really is, I think that there will be a lot of opportunities for that knowledge to be used and be helpful for families.
Yeah, I mean, I more and more, the more people I talk to, the more I realize that research is so important. And I feel like we're really I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I feel like we're really scratching the surface on what we
Mhm.
need to know.
Yeah.
And you said it. We've got about 200 genes identified, but you're anticipating 500 or 1,000. I mean, that means we've still got a long way to go,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so, can you
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about kind of the importance of research in general, and specifically the genetic research that you're doing?
Sure, sure. So I would say that the biggest reason to participate in genetic research in autism is that because this will just help researchers understand the biology of autism and be able to give people an explanation of what autism is. It will be different in many people, but there will be some similarities and in others that we may not expect. And I think that with getting to that biological understanding of autism, we're going to move the fields much forward and be able to try to develop treatments for the core symptoms of autism for people who are wanting those treatments. Not everybody is on the spectrum wants or needs treatments for these core symptoms, but a lot of people do.
Right.
My son has intellectual disability and pretty severe language impairments. He's 17, but it is disheartening to go to his IEP meeting and see that his percentile of certain language skills are in the below 1 percentile. And do I think that there's possibility of a pharmaceutical treatment that will help that? I do. And I think the only way that we can get there is if we understand what's happening in the cells of people with autism, and we don't know that yet. And genetics and biology is one way of getting there.
Right.
It's slow going, but there's been so much progress made in the past decade, even since he was diagnosed. He just turned 17, so that was 14 years ago. I would say probably 100 genes have been discovered since he was diagnosed. And the landscape is very different. And, I think that there are a lot of people on the spectrum where treatments are needed and desired.
It sounds like what you just said. It sounds like the research is picking up in terms of speed. Is that an accurate statement? Or is it that we're getting better at identifying?
I think the big game changer for genetics is certainly the advent of these next generation sequencing technologies, which came online about a decade ago. And so they definitely, in the first 2, 3, 4 years they were available, they were still very expensive. But now it is economical for researchers to sequence as many people as we can find and be able to use that data. And try to mine it and get all the information we can out of it to deepen our understanding.
I have a question for you about your son and how that impacts you and your drive and your decision making and your research. I imagine that plays a big part, but I would love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of ways that I think my experience with him influences the way I think and what motivates me. I think with Spark, really understanding what it means to be an autism mom and an autism family, I think I have a deep connection and deep understanding of our participants. Not everybody. I mean, again, the spectrum is very, very wide, and I certainly don't have the experience of many people, but I think when you meet another autism mom, you immediately start talking about your kid and where they are in the spectrum and what you've done and what they do and, all the things. So I think there's that. But I also think that just living with autism every day, I get it. And I really do hope that one day that there will be some treatments for the core symptoms of autism. Just like Dylan has medication for ADHD that really helps him, something that would help along the repetitive behavior domain or the social communication domain to just help him a little bit, combined with the ABA, I think, it could be a real game changer. And that thinking about that and thinking that it is definitely within our reach definitely drives me. And then one final thing I'll say is that I think that no matter what, I always remember that behind all of the data, there are people. And, I get to analyze a lot of very large data sets with, tens of thousands of rows of data. And I know that behind every single row is a person. Maybe not exactly like my son, but maybe like my son, and with all of their unique challenges and unique characteristics. My son has a lot of unique characteristics. He loves the movie Elf. He loves hand dryers. He has a love-hate relationship with smoke alarms. He's a very unique character. And, I think about that all the time. I think each row is someone. And we have to respect all participants, their participation, be grateful for their participation. Sometimes I'm like, why are these people participating? Right. It's so much effort. But yeah, I think I just feel a lot of gratitude.
Yeah. I mean, that's such a phenomenal perspective. I think sometimes we get caught up, and as a clinician, I get caught up in, I got to get this treatment plan written, and I got to get this information out there, and I got to get this graph to look right. And, oh man, my axes are messed up. And, I get stuck in that. But the reality is it's information about a person, about a human, mm-hmm. about somebody mm-hmm. who may or may not need help, but, in my situation, they have asked for it. So it's such a great reminder of like, the data is not the data tells part of the story, but there's a person, there's a human, and they're a part of the family, and they've got other environmental factors and all those things. I want to ask you a question about the CDC just released a statement about 1 in 44 children are diagnosed with autism. Right. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's a big leap. So the previous data was done from data 2 years before this data set, I believe. And in that data, it was 1 in 56. So here we're at 144. I think some of the positives out of that are that there's less disparity between children of Caucasian ancestry and kids of other ancestries. I think Asian, Pacific Islander, African American kids, the numbers are higher. So there is some positive coming out of this, that there's less disparity, at least in terms of getting a diagnosis. I think there's still many other disparities in other areas in terms of time of diagnosis and the percent with comorbidities like intellectual disability. But I think it's just we are at least getting much better at recognizing autism. And I think that has really changed, even again, since the time my son was diagnosed. I think there's so much more awareness and care taken to look at the early signs of autism in the general pediatrician's office. So, I think there's a lot of awareness about autism now, so that's good. But yeah, there are a lot of kids that need help and a lot of services that they need.
Right. And the diagnosis is the first part of it, right? That there's still a need for services and therapies, or maybe not, right? Every family again is unique, right. But I like that point about there's less disparity. I think I remember taking my kids to see the pediatrician, and there was a question, let's talk about their language. Let's talk about their social interactions. And it wasn't anything in depth, but it was at least bringing up the conversation, which, my kids are 5 and 7. And so that wasn't that long ago that those conversations were happening. And so I'm, happy that we're having more of those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, the earlier the intervention, the better. And so that's what really, really matters, that kids are getting recognized earlier.
Right. I do want to talk a little bit about your research at Spark, and I want to hear a little bit about what you're doing and how you're using that information. Can you give us a little summary?
Yeah, sure. So what I do at Spark is we analyze the genomic data and we identify the genetic changes in the kids or the people with autism in our study that we think are causing or a major genetic contribution to their autism. So in about 10% of participants so far, we've been able to identify some kind of genetic change that we think is significant for their autism. And in almost all cases, people do want to hear about this. And so we have contacted them. I think we're almost have returned 1,000 results so far. Research is slow. It's not fast by any means, but we are definitely working hard at it. And, identifying some of the things I mentioned earlier, some of these de novo changes, some of them are inherited, some of them are on the X chromosome. So the genes that are involved are very numerous. I think we've returned findings in 200 different things so far. And what I can say is that all the people who have gotten results are then invited to participate in a genetic registry that's specific to their condition. So it's either a study at Simon's Foundation called Simon's Searchlight, but there are many other different registries across the genetic landscape of autism. And so we hope that those people go on to participate in those. And what researchers would like to do is to study large groups of people with the same genetic etiology and look at those similarities and differences and compare them to others. And by getting to a genotype or genetically driven research view of autism, we can start to learn more about what makes people with autism of one gene versus people with autism with another gene, and try to understand it that way. And it's slow going, but it's definitely coming along. And by analyzing everyone's data and finding the results, we're able to give this information to families. And so there are a lot of things that go along with that. I mean, not just can they now participate in this genetically driven research, but I think for a lot of families, it's a bit of a relief to have an answer that's very medical in nature. And, I think it absolves a lot of parents of these unnecessary feelings of guilt that a lot of families feel, because with everything, it's hard to if there isn't an objective cause, it's easy to try to find, all the reasons, all the things that you did wrong that might be contributing. Right. So, I think for that's definitely been a positive for many families.
Right. It was the one time I ate non-organic chips while I was pregnant. That
yes,
caused it, right?
Exactly. It's all the Diet Coke I drank. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's so easy to find that. And that's such a slippery slope. I mean,
yes,
families have enough going on. They don't need to beat themselves up for those types of things.
Yes.
I want to go back to something you said, and I'm hoping you can expand on it, but you said 10% of the participants in your study, you find a genetic change. Yeah. Is that from previous testing? Is that compared to other participants? Is that compared to their family members?
So 10% is of, so we do exome sequencing. So that's sequencing of the 20,000 genes across the human genome. And by analyzing someone with autism's DNA, we can identify genetic changes that they're usually things that disrupt a gene's function. And so those kinds of changes are easy to spot in a sense, because you can map out what the cause would be, what the consequence would be of that change, and then be able to identify things that are going to be disruptive to a subset of genes, or sometimes the chromosome material is duplicated or deleted, but it's involved genes that we know about. But it's also iterative. So we're always reanalyzing the data and taking a closer look at things that we suspect might be causative, but we don't quite have enough data to show that it is. And so by doing this iterative analysis, we're able to, maybe this year we don't find something, but, the following year we do. And that's happened many times already, where we've found something 2 or 3 years ago and said, let's keep this here in the swatch pile because it looks pretty interesting and could be causal. But then, as publications come out and as we get more data, we're able to say with more certainty that, these certain changes are involved in autism. And so we've been able to publish several papers describing our findings and identifying new autism genes. And we have a big paper under review right now, and hopefully it will come out in the next few months.
It's so interesting that, like, as you're describing this, I'm realizing how much we're really dependent on technology, and how had the technology not existed, I'm almost thinking like,
yes,
as science progresses and as the technology progresses, then you can progress with your research. But had science not progressed, then we would still be kind of in the dark a little bit, and we wouldn't know. We wouldn't be able to say it.
Absolutely. And I think this is across the board. I mean, just like, I think the presence of genetics in our lives is much more than it ever was. With COVID aside, I mean, everyone knows what a variant is now, so that's good. So there's one positive from COVID, but I think people are very familiar with sequencing and DNA and 23andMe and Ancestry.com. I mean, I think all of these things have been good for research because people are more familiar with what we're doing.
So amazing. So I have a question for you. It sounds like there's a lot happening and there's a lot that is being developed. What's something that you were excited to learn in the last year?
That's a great question. Oh my goodness. I haven't gotten that one yet. Something that I was excited to learn in the past year. So we've touched on de novo mutations, right? De novo changes that occur in the agar cell. But much more important are inherited risk factors. So these are genetic differences that do get passed from a parent to a child with autism. These things, by definition, are in genetics terms called less penetrant. So these changes are things that we're going to have less of an effect. So in the parents, they may or may not cause autism or other mental, health conditions. But in the kid with autism, things are different, and the kid with the child has autism. And so we've known for a long time that these kinds of inherited genetic risk factors are part of autism, but they're really hard to find because, by definition, they're hard to find because if it's a variant that sometimes leads to autism, but not always, it's hard to distinguish, make that distinction. And so you need a lot of data and a lot of people. And so in the past year, we have been able to identify some genes that we think are acting this way. And we're excited to share these findings, and hopefully in a few months, we'll have our paper out. Our findings are already out there in the scientific literature, so we post them on the preprint server called bioRxiv. So this is a pre-publication space where scientists share their findings with other people. So they already are out there, but the paper is under peer review right now. And so we think it's going to be really exciting to be able to say that we've starting to identify different types of genetic changes that are involved in autism, because there's a much bigger piece of the genetic risk pie that is inherited versus the de novo risk. And so hopefully it's just the tip of the iceberg, and we can, with more data that we're always churning out at Spark, we'll be able to get into this much more and identify other things.
That's fascinating, being able to find I mean, in essence, in my head, I'm thinking
Yeah.
almost it's like hide and seek, right? Like
Yes.
they're trying to hide and they don't want to be found, maybe, and
Yes.
you're trying to
Yes.
find them, and you
Yes.
found.
Yes. That's exactly it. Yeah. Yeah. So it's something that sometimes causes autism. But if you find enough people with a change with autism, you can show that statistically this is present in more people in autism than without, even though it doesn't always lead to, an autism diagnosis. Maybe it leads to other things like social anxiety or language delay or something like that in the parent, but or maybe not. But yeah, it is with genetics. It is about finding those needles in the haystack and have enough of the same in autism versus non-autism.
Right. Well, for me, I'm just forever grateful and thankful that we have a diverse group of people doing research to help us, figure out all the layers, if you will, of autism, the genetic components and all the behavioral components. There's so much that goes into it that to all the researchers out there, thank you for trying to help us figure out what needs to be figured out so that we can plan for future generations and those to come. I think it's so important. So Pam, for families who are going to participate in the Spark research, what's the involvement like for them? What does participation look like?
Great. So we designed Spark so that you could participate from your couch if you so choose. So you just have to go to sparkforautism.org and sign up for an account. And if you want to participate in the genetic analysis, you can. You don't have to, but you can. And most people do. And we'll mail you a saliva collection kit. So it's just a tube that you either will spit into, or if the person with autism doesn't want to spit, you can squeegee or sponge the saliva out of their mouth and send in the saliva that way. And then we'll send you a lot of links to questionnaires where we collect some information about the person with autism and the other symptoms that they have, family history, and other stuff that's really helpful for researchers. But another piece of Spark is that what we've wanted to do is build a cohort that is available to the entire research community. So researchers actually write applications and apply to Spark. And we have a committee that includes external scientists as well as people at the Science Foundation, where we look at the scientific merit of these different applications and decide, make sure that the studies are sound and have some scientific value. And then we'll contact people who are eligible for these studies, and they can choose to participate or not. So in this way, we're helping the research community recruit participants for their own studies, because recruiting is really quite a challenge for many scientists and not what they, have expertise in. And it helps participants too. They get to choose what they want to participate in, especially if they see, a research study that's on a topic that's of interest to them. What we really try and do is return information that's helpful. Before we started Spark, we heard a lot from parents, and they told us that they had participated in research but never heard anything about what happened or what the results were. And so one piece of Spark is that we really value the communication back to the participants. So we ask researchers to help us with that, and so that participants aren't left hanging or never told or never hear again about what happened. Just so that people can understand the importance of their efforts, because participating in research when you are an autism family is challenging, and we want to make sure that people are valued. So that's another piece of Spark that I think is exciting for research, but also hopefully helpful for participants too, to be able to learn something about themselves.
In some ways, it's really paying it forward to other researchers, right? Being able to say, here are some other people who may be interested. But then also that feedback is so important, right? Like I would want to know if I was involved in a study, I would want to know what was the data used for? How was it helpful? Did I ultimately, did my participation make a difference? And maybe not for me or for my family, but for somebody.
Right. And just wanting to understand the impact. We want to make sure that participants get that feedback, the information of what the results were and what that meant for the research community and what the next steps might be in that researcher's work.
That's great. I mean, more and more I hear about people doing research, finding research, being involved in it. And it's great if people if there's overlap. You don't need to find, I think to your point, a lot of researchers spend time trying to find participants. My daughter's participated in a couple of research studies locally where we live. And finding the participants is hard, and then following up. And then some of the studies are you check in after 2 years or, other things like that. It's got to be really difficult for researchers to overcome that barrier. So this is a great way to support the community in that. Yeah.
I mean, we hope that by working at scale, we get some gains of efficiency. And I think that we have so far, just by having the infrastructure and whole staff set up for this endeavor. We're able to keep going and keep churning out research studies.
Pam, where can we find more information about Spark, about the research that you're doing? You mentioned where there's some other publications. Where can we find all of that?
You can go to sparkforautism.org. So everything that we've ever published is listed there. Everything that anyone has ever published on the Spark cohort is listed there. There are probably up to, 30, 40 publications that have come out looking at Spark data. And information on how to join is there. There's many articles about different families, people who have received results, people who have not received results, people who are independent adults, people who are impacted and have need a lot of support. So there are many different angles there.
Great. Well, thank you for the research you're doing, and thank you for your time today. We really appreciate it and your insight.
Thanks.
I hope you learned as much as I did from that conversation with Dr. Pamela Feliciano. And whether you're a participant in research or you value the information, I hope that you find this helpful in understanding how Spark runs their research and how they're supporting not just the autism community, but also the research community as well. And if you're looking for more information, feel free to check out our show notes where we'll have links to their website. As always, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Autism Therapies. And if you have a show suggestion or other feedback, feel free to send us an email at allautismtalk@learnbehavioral.com. And please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, take care, be safe.
We hope you've enjoyed today's episode of All Autism Talk. This podcast is brought to you by Learn Behavioral, the leading network of providers serving children with autism and other special needs. Visit us at learnbehavioral.com. Listen to previous episodes at allautismtalk.com, on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. All Autism Talk, connecting the autism community one podcast at a time.